All right, everybody, welcome to this week's episode of McStay on What Matters. This week, I'm really excited to have with me Glenn Lesko. Glenn is a partner at Pender and Howe, a recruitment expert, a leadership expert, and has been doing a lot of interesting things in the industry for a while now. So, Glenn, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate your time. I'm not sure my wife would agree I'm an expert in anything, but I'm very glad to be here. So thanks for the invitation.
Well, you're very welcome. And I have found from my experience that the people who immediately deflect and say they're not an expert in things are the ones that I typically want to listen to about those topics.
Kind words. Thank you.
All right. Well, for people who don't know you, people tuning into the show, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get to where you are now?
Well, thanks. I'm from Alberta, from Edmonton specifically. Went to University of Alberta. Joined this profession in 1997, which I know is a long time ago. Pender and Howe has an office in Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, Montreal, Boston, and New York. And we do three things. We do executive recruitment. We do board governance, board culture change, rejuvenation, etc. And we do some work in human capital consulting where organizations are trying to figure out what their needs are. They have a general idea of a need, but a leadership need, but they're not quite sure how to galvanize that in action. So those are the three areas we work in. And I'm so happy to be here to talk about leadership and all the good things you're going to talk about.
Yeah, no, I'm likewise. I'm happy to chat. Before we jump into that, I'm always curious. You said you went to the University of Alberta. What did you study and how did that lead into recruiting? Because you've been in recruiting for quite some time, very experienced in that. What made you get into that field?
Well, I took a Bachelor of Science, which I really love. I'm a science guy by nature. And this just sort of fell into my step in 97. I worked in pharmaceuticals before this and got tapped on the shoulder to explore a recruitment career. And I had no idea what it was. And one thing led to another, and it started to take off. And I was very blessed to have success in it in Edmonton and across Western Canada. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I pivoted to move into and co-found Pender and Howe, and really started looking at more executive roles, more retained recruitment, and really more leadership thought, working with people who have an organization or work with an organization or with a team, and they lead that organization, they lead those teams, and they're looking for top talent. And there really was a gap in the marketplace to support people who need top talent, not just to say, find us a CFO, but really more understand the needs of that organization, understand the needs and the drive of the leadership team, and find people congruent with those needs. And that's really what led us to the firm and leads me here today.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I think that's you guys recognized an untapped market. You do recruitment a little bit differently than maybe some of the firms that have been around for a long time, doing it the same way for a long time. I think for me, and kind of one of the topics I want to talk about today is this theme of judgment. Using judgment and how, as leaders, it's required of us to do that in a kind of an even-keeled and respectful way. For you as a leader, as well as someone who recruits leaders, when did you kind of realize, and what made you realize that leadership is about more than just execution of things, that it's about these judgment calls and decisions?
Well, that's a good question. I think that, early on in a person's career or even in their life, the idea of what is leadership, being a captain on a soccer team or a hockey team or understanding how to motivate others and bring them along is something we learn early on in our life, whether it's through sports, whether it's through academia, whether it's perhaps through music in a band. And I think that it's really critical to look back on our successes and if there are young people watching this, to involve themselves in those opportunities early on so you develop those skills. But, leadership is not something necessarily that I see people that have a little gray on the sidewalls. I think leadership can begin at a very early age. And I think that when you look at judgment, it's the same sort of idea. We teach our kids to make good choices, to make good judgment calls early on, or we ought to. and everybody succeeds and everybody has failed in judgment calls, and same thing with leadership. So I think it's a continuum that starts early on in all of us. And so as you move up into academia, you move into the workforce, regardless of what role you're doing, there are always these leadership opportunities, whether it's one-on-one or one-on-many, to support others and to move towards a direction as a leader. And that could be micro, that could be macro. And same thing with judgment. We are constantly thinking about what we should do or shouldn't do based on a judgment theme. And I find that now, looking and working with senior leaders, those people tend to often have honed skills in judgment and in leadership. And it's not just that president, CEO, or VP has a particularly well-suited judgment. It's something that likely has been honed over time. And I think that's how I look at it a little bit. And for myself, it's the same thing. You all can say you practice judgment or you practice leadership because you never become an expert in it, in my opinion. You're always learning and getting better and figuring things out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense for me. Keying on one of your comments you made about how leadership doesn't have to be more senior people in age necessarily. It can be something that you practice and do at any point in your career. I think a big topic, obviously, right now is obviously AI, what AI is going to do to white-collar jobs, which are going away and which aren't. For me, I think that one of the big things is judgment, and the ability to be a human leader is going to be a differentiator. If you're talking to, say, college-age students and they're looking at a future career path that, might the jobs they're going to be doing 10 years from now might not even exist yet, what type of things would you recommend that they do to build these skills of leadership and judgment so that they're prepared for whatever might come up?
Well, I think at the end of the day, judgment or leadership, if you focus on judgment, it's typically about outcomes. And whether that's a decision analysis outcome or a decision analysis deliverable, on a more micro way, is it, for example, I'm at the grocery store and I need to make a judgment, some decisions on healthy eating, or is tonight a chicken fingers and fries night? I mean, it's a silly micro example, but we face those judgment calls all the time. And I think whether you're newer in your career or later in your career, I always look at what is the input and what's the output. What's the goal of that judgment to be? And sometimes that goal can be very clear. And sometimes that goal is really to get you to one step, and then you start again to the second, to third, and by the fourth, that's the success. That's the answer. So on the judgment side, I think that looking at the problem or looking at a scenario or situation and figuring out what the end point needs to be is important. And so that could be something that you're looking at a decision to open up a new office or scale your sales force in the States. And the outcome might not be crystal clear, but you're moving it forward one building block at a time. And the judgment is your go, no go, risk, no risk scenarios. And where judgment breaks down at times is that old coin term analysis paralysis. Should we do this? I'm not sure, but, well, it looks good. I'm not sure, but eventually it's a lot like Google. If you get too close, Google Earth, too close to the ground, it gets fuzzy. There's a certain point where you have to be high enough up where you see clarity. When you get lower down, it gets fuzzy. So, understanding that it's really an ensemble of risk mitigation, endpoint discussions, resources, and how you're going to deal with the question you have that started the judgment problem or question. That's the way I look at it. It's a bigger picture analysis. And sometimes the endpoint is never complete clarity. It just gets you to the next decision to get you through the decision tree to the next decision. So in my example, sure, chicken breasts and vegetables are a better outcome, but that's a super simple example. But whether you're going to scale in one state or the other state or one province, the other province, using your judgment to come up with an answer and using your analytical skills, it's a more involved thing that sometimes people say, well, that was bad judgment call. Well, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But at the time, the exit to that judgment was not clear. And it was your best decision. And now you take it and you leapfrog to the next judgment and the next outcome. I think judgment and leadership, there's a term that intertwines there in my mind, and that's instinct. And I think instinct is a big part of that. Instinct doesn't necessarily mean short, abbreviated decisions. It means using your instinct, different than gut, using what you've taught, what you've learned to impact your judgment towards a favorable outcome. Because remember, judgment is all about getting to a favorable outcome, whether that's judging somebody in an interview, whether that's judging the quality of the movie you're watching, whether that's judging the analysis of scaling your business to the United States. There's an outcome that matters.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe looping it back to the recruiting side of what you do, what are some of the more common challenges today that companies bring to you to find somebody to help them with? And how does that instinct piece play into that? Because I would imagine as a professional recruiter, you've interviewed hundreds of successful executives. You have to be able to look at their level of success and what they've done, both from the lens of how much have they impacted that versus how much did the company do. And I'm sure you've developed a bit of an instinct and a way of looking through that. So when you brought these problems from your client that's looking for somebody, how do you determine how much instinct or judgment the person that might be a fit for it would be? Because it's not the same, I would imagine, as you're recruiting a software coder and they have to have a certain skill set. They need to know this language, that language. You can see examples of their work. Examples of leadership are tougher to quantify.
Yeah. Well, it's a good thought. I think the answer to that, and maybe that's some of our special sauce, is that the analysis, the judgment, working with people is the middle point. It's the middle of it. The beginning starts way earlier, before there's even candidate assessments, there's any of that. It starts with understanding an organization. And that sounds so simplistic, but when you understand an organization and you actually go to meet them and you tour the facility and you meet their leadership team, and fun fact, you go to their coffee room to get a coffee and you watch the people's attitudes, the chatter, you feel the vibe of the organization in that common meeting room. It might sound a bit hokey, but that's how you start to learn the organization. And then when you start talking about their need, not the position, but the need, and often we listen to the position, it's actually the wrong title. It ought to be something different. And then you discuss with them and we start to become that trusted advisor for that organization, because you're embedded in their need and solution requirements. And all along it's judgment, all along it's building that instinct, all along it's being curious. So once you have that unpacked and you're able to talk to them about, give them some trusted counsel around title or marketplace compensation or whatever it is, at that point, and only that point, do you begin a search strategy. Then you start reaching out to people and moving from there. So I think, going back to judgment, leadership, instinct, a lot of it begins with relationships. And it doesn't matter what sector you're in. You talk about coding, or you talk about a CFO for a major organization, or somebody from Europe opening up a business in North America. That relationship, that understanding of the business, that common human to human interaction, and quite frankly, that trust bond, that begins at the very beginning. And that weaves itself all the way through leadership. It weaves itself all the way through judgment, decision-making, everything. And to me, that's how you build that continuum. And that's how you have positive outcomes. I caution our team to use the word, we're not recruiters, we're not headhunters. We lead a process to find human capital. And although that doesn't sound necessarily that different, it is different when you look at what the continuum is and when you start that journey and you start working with that organization, and then when you finish. And that's, I think, part of the answer to your question.
Yeah, and I think you've brought up a couple of times now about communication and kind of listening, and that as a skill set. For you as a leader and someone who finds leaders, what kind of advice would you give about positive communication styles and active listening? And there's all these catchphrases, but in practice, what do you find the most useful ways for you to really understand that client need that you're talking to?
Well, I think taking it to a common human to human level, although that again sounds perhaps unusual, is the magic. Everybody in life has stressors. Everybody in life has good days, bad days. Everybody does some amazing things in their life, personally, professionally, wherever it is, family. And so getting to understand people at a human level is important, because that's where you start to understand who they are individually. And then from there, you build on the professional side, you build on the need side, etc. So, fun fact, and very, very often, if I speak to somebody at an executive level, I'll ask them about how their life is, ask them about sports, be very general, just really let them free flow which direction they want to go. And then when we talk about a position or an opportunity or an organization, I turn it over to them and say, fire away. You ask me anything you want to know, and I'll give you the answers, and you can drink coffee and listen. Depressurized, give them all the information they need to make a decision or to explore this opportunity or to think about the leadership requirements in an organization as it's commensurate with their skills. Only after that do we really start unpacking their background. So when you talk about communication and we talk about letting people ask all the questions that they want, and they feel more comfortable at that point because they're getting the answers they like, or the answers that maybe show them that the role is not for them, but that unpacks it from their angle. And now you're building a relationship through communication rather than a very hard pointed question and answer session. So the communication is key. And I think the other thing we should think about is where does communication happen? COVID brought us Teams and Zoom and all those things. And in some ways that was amazing. And in other ways, it kind of hurt us coming out of that, because individuals, sometimes organizations, were reticent to go back to the old face-to-face conversations in an office or a coffee shop. And I think sometimes when you go meet at a coffee shop that's confidential-ish, et cetera, and you just have a cup of coffee, knee to knee, and you're unpacking an opportunity or a solution or just a discussion, that communication could be much more successful in an environment like that. Perhaps that communication needs to happen in a formal boardroom, which is fine, but somehow getting out behind the camera and meeting people live where they are is a big part of the success to communication, not just how you do it, but where you do it and the approach to you doing it, etc.
Yeah, no, that makes sense for sure. So when you're working with leaders, you've communicated well with them, you understand what they're looking for. You're now kind of getting to the point where, some judgment needs to be applied, some experience needs to be applied. How do you help leaders to decide what they truly need versus what they think they need? Because you mentioned it a little bit earlier about the position title might be wrong or the brief might not be right. How do you use that communication and relationship you've built up to maybe shift or to lead them into other ideas of how they might think about a position?
Well, I think there's two lenses to that. If you're working with the organization, like I said, early on, we have to allow them to think about the role and guide them through that decision tree so that when they look at prospective candidates, there's some elasticity to that profile. Excuse me. And there's some opportunity to look at a person, a profile, a skill set from a different angle and from an elastic angle rather than a rigid must have these 10 skills. When you look at the prospective candidate, it's the same thing. We have to realize that these are people, they're families, they're human beings, they're not robots. And so they might want to change. What drives that change? What drives the desire for change? Is it monetary? Is it travel? Is it promotion? And when we apply the judgment lens to that person, or better, maybe better termed, an analysis or a fit lens for them versus other roles, I think it's the same thing. We have to encourage them to pull apart why we're meeting and pull apart what the goals, the outcome of a successful change is. And I often say, like, if you had a magic wand and you could take that magic wand and wave it and make that ideal position, tell me about the position, the title, the scope, the comp, but tell me how it would impact your family. Tell me how it would impact your travel. Tell me what you think the next step beyond that would be, and why is this role for you? And we have that discussion and you break it apart like that, there's a lot of aha moments come from it, because it creates a reason for people to think about the change, the opportunity, or the candidate on the other side differently. And when you think about it differently, it really opens up possibilities. So if I said, Sean, come for dinner Saturday, and you say, what? And I said, I don't know. What do you like? And there's all these possibilities. We talk about an amazing meal, or I say, you're getting hamburgers. Hamburgers are fine. But if I start questioning you what your favorites are and what you like as a paired side and what kind of wine you like, all of a sudden you might get a much more deeper, perfect fit meal. So it's the same analysis when you're judging, again, or looking at a people or an organization through a decision tree lens.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Um, when you're looking at that decision tree lens, and I'm talking specifically about the hiring managers, so the company you're working with, what are some of the biggest pitfalls that they run into, or stumbling blocks that they run into? Maybe things like being too specific, or having a wrong image of what the candidate might be in their heads. What are some of the biggest stumbling blocks that you see on the hiring side?
Well, at the executive level, usually there's a group of people involved in the decision to hire. And one of the big pitfalls is not getting consensus. If 5 people making a decision, if one says, I don't want to hire Bob or Betty, what happens then? Do they have a veto? So at the beginning of that process, we come together with that organization and we encourage or form an interview committee, and we charge that interview committee with responsibilities, and we lead them through the process of deciding and thinking about the appropriate candidate. And at that point in time, we talk about go, no-go actions. So if person number 4, whatever their title is, doesn't like Bob or Betty, is that an instant no, or is that a let's unpack what you don't like and let's go back to the skills that you think are missing? And then let's talk about, when we created the profile for this ideal person, were those skills compulsory or are those skills nice to have? If they're nice to have, then it's not a red light. If they were compulsory, then it's a red light. And so really having the rules of engagement before you go into the interview process, really charging that interview committee with their responsibility and predicting what will happen this way or that way, and having some predefined goals at the back end, that's the way to get around that. And I think that's one of the perils to your question is what happens. And it's not so much the judgment or the analysis of the candidate skills. That's fairly evident. It's the soft factors that may or may not be missing. It's somebody's judgment at the end that says, oh, I think we needed this. But at the beginning, we asked that question and it was never brought up. But at back end, it changes. We call it profile creep. The profile's crept off target because it hasn't been kept on center. And so those are some of the things that I think are key to keeping, an executive interview committee focused on positive outcomes with the candidates. And the last thing I'll say on that, and it sounds super simplistic, but urgency and velocity matters. And it doesn't mean you have to interview somebody tomorrow and interview them the next day. But if there's a gap in time, or if the committee is not willing to elasticize their schedules to make sure that they're available, and things don't move in a fluid way, every once in a while somebody gets sick and there's a little challenge with scheduling. But if there's not a momentum, it's not a cadence through the process, people feel it. Candidates feel it. And when they feel that, they start to wonder if it's the organization for them, especially leaders coming in that are expected to make change and create a vision and operationalize that vision. If they feel that there's going to be stutter steps or barriers there that are unrealistic, then that cadence needs to be there.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think that for candidates, they will often equate that urgency, or at least a sense of urgency, with importance or lack of importance for this role. Like, if it takes weeks and weeks in between interviews, they're not making time for this. How important is this role? And at an executive level that you recruit at, someone making a change, that's a big step. Speaking of that, from the candidate side, on the executive level, what are some of the biggest pitfalls there that you see candidates struggling with?
Well, I think the first one is what we just talked about, ensuring that the candidates know the reason that they want to make this change. At this level, it's very rare that there's tire kickers. That's more at a perhaps more junior level or earlier in people's careers. But really understand what the driver is. Is it money? Not usually at this level. Is it title and career progression? Yes. But what does that mean? And how willing are you to, for example, travel more, but to accomplish the progression through your career and those sort of things. And so that's why really unpacking these drivers with candidates. So when they go in there, they can see what's the congruency between the role and the opportunity and your true feelings about making a change. The other thing I think that is really important is understanding where the organization is going. So For example, if an organization is, as we say, building the plane in the air, and they've got visibility to 6 or 12 months, but really after that, it's such a growing, burgeoning organization that it's going upwards, but nobody really knows which direction, but they know it's in a positive direction. That might be as clear as it can be for that organization. And for some candidates, that's exciting. It's a chance to build and not say beyond the end of the runway, but know that there's more runway and there's more to build. Others feel that that's way too risky. They're not risk tolerant to that sort of thing, and they're not available and interested in that. But there's something about defining that early to the candidates and to the clients to identify that lack of visibility or some positive chaos is exciting or it's not. And so candidates that look for an opportunity need to think about where that organization is going, not just the opportunity, not that just a CFO or not just the chief science officer, but where is that company going? Do they want to be part of that direction? And maybe beyond the sight line of where it's going, do we want to continue to be part of a direction that they're helping to build? And I think that's a pitfall sometimes that candidates don't realize.
Yeah, and I think that having that understanding of where the organization's going, where they want to go, I've definitely heard people that have had struggles with that. I think the other thing too, and I'm sure you run into this, maybe you've got some advice for people who are listening, is when you get to a certain level, you have experience with job interviews, you have experience with things like you know how to answer the question the right way, but it might not be the right way for you as a candidate. What kind of advice do you give candidates if you feel that maybe they're veering a little bit towards like fulfilling the role with their answers and their process rather than fulfilling what they are actually looking for and what they're comfortable with?
Well, I can tell you, having facilitated and sat in many, 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 many interviews, pick a title, a president or a CEO, they get nervous the night before, and they drink that coffee with a little shaky hand, and it's exciting, and it gives them a little tummy upset to go into a meeting like this, even though they can stand in a boardroom, their own boardroom, and dictate direction. And the same thing with some of the interviewers who are coming in there and they're not quite sure because maybe they don't do a lot of interviewing, and we help facilitate that. But there's nerves on both sides. And it goes back to my initial discussion. We're all people. And we're all humans going through this journey. And so I always encourage people to realize that nerves are good, and nerves keep you on a sharp point, and that the other side is nervous too. So it's okay to explore this and unpack it in a calm way. And if people stutter, or if people answer it the wrong way, or if they step on their words, it's okay. Nobody expects these to come out perfectly. You do these events, Sean, you know that it's not scripted. It doesn't come out perfectly. Sometimes there's a hiccup in what's said or come back on a thought. But at the end of the day, it's not the sentence. It's not the paragraph. It's the experience and it's the understanding. You talk about judgment from the beginning. People are looking at an opportunity and an organization and the people they're sitting across from. And those people are looking at this person and they're judging and they're thinking and they're understanding that person and what they can bring. And so at the end of the day, if you just think about it as a process and experience, and everybody's humble and open, they have to make decisions, of course. But if they're humble and open and they're willing to make some micro mistakes and have a laugh or two through the process, that's the best outcome. In fact, I think that often people going into an interview ought to know the questions. They ought to know the questions so they can prepare for them and they can have a much learned discussion. I'm not a big fan of walking in and having to verbally skate through questions and having zingers thrown at them. I mean, silly things like if you were a tree or if you're a car. I mean, that's old school stuff. But what would you be? I mean, let's talk about the questions and then bring some answers and have a deep, thoughtful discussion on how you could contribute to an organization based on those questions. So that human approach, I think, is the way to do it.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect way to end it off. That human approach, having a very open relationship with your recruiter, with the company maybe that you're looking at, and then being able to use the theme of judgment and all the things we've talked about that throughout the episode to be successful. Glenn, thank you so much for being on the episode today. For everyone watching, I'll put links down below to Glenn's profile and his company information. So if you have any searches coming up, or if you have any questions about human capital management, definitely reach out. And from there, thanks for watching.
Thanks for having me, Sean.